Every human being has an internal clock. It is a cluster of 20,000 neurons in your hypothalamus, and it has been ticking since before you were born. At 25, this clock kept you unconscious until morning. By 65, the same clock, running on less melatonin, weaker signals, and a rhythm that has physically shifted earlier by 2 to 3 hours, fires a wake signal somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. The ceiling becomes familiar. Your mind starts before your eyes are fully open. And the harder you try to fall back asleep, the more awake your brain becomes. This is not insomnia. This is not anxiety. This is physics. 4 systems inside your body that all shifted with age, converging at the same hour every night. And the thoughts that arrive at 3 a.m. feel different from the same thoughts at 3 p.m. because your brain is running a different program in the dark, and the part that would normally tell you those thoughts are not emergencies is still asleep. Your internal clock shifted earlier, and nobody told you. Inside your hypothalamus sits a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, your master circadian clock. This clock generates a near 24-hour rhythm that controls when you feel alert and when you feel sleepy, when cortisol rises and when melatonin releases, when body temperature peaks and when it drops. In a young adult, this clock is calibrated so that peak sleepiness arrives around 11 at night and peak alertness arrives around 9 or 10 in the morning. The clock holds a schedule because it is synchronized to the day-night cycle by light entering the eyes, specifically by blue light at 480 nanometers, activating melanopsin-containing cells in the retina that send signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. As you age, the clock shifts earlier, a process called circadian phase advance. Dirk-Jan Dijk and colleagues documented this shift across multiple studies. The sleepiness signal arrives earlier in the evening, 7 or 8 instead of 11, and the wake signal arrives earlier in the morning, 3 or 4 instead of 6 or 7. The shift is not subtle. It can move the entire sleep-wake window forward by 2 to 3 hours. With age, the suprachiasmatic nucleus itself degrades. Neurons deteriorate. The amplitude of the circadian signal weakens. The peaks become shallower and the troughs less deep, like a radio station losing transmitter power until the signal becomes fuzzy and inconsistent. The clock's sensitivity to the light cues that keep it synchronized to the external day diminishes through 2 mechanisms operating simultaneously. The aging lens of the eye yellows and thickens, filtering more blue light at 480 nanometers before it reaches the melanopsin cells in the retina, the cells that signal the clock. And the suprachiasmatic neurons themselves respond less robustly to whatever signal does arrive. The clock is receiving a weaker input through a cloudier window, and the neurons processing that input are less responsive than they were. The result is a clock that drifts. And when the circadian clock drifts in the absence of strong light cues, it drifts earlier. Phase advance is the default direction of an unanchored aging clock. Melatonin, the hormone the pineal gland releases at night to initiate and maintain sleep, declines with age. The pineal gland calcifies gradually over decades, reducing its functional tissue and its capacity to produce melatonin. By 65, nighttime melatonin levels can be a fraction of what they were at 30, sometimes 1/3, sometimes 1/4, sometimes less. The hormone that should be holding you asleep through the second half of the night is present in insufficient quantity to do the job it was assigned. Melatonin does not just initiate sleep, it maintains the depth and continuity of sleep across the full night. When melatonin is low, the sleep it produces is shallower, more fragmented, and more vulnerable to interruption. Even if you fall asleep at a reasonable hour, the low melatonin cannot hold you through to morning. What this means is direct. Your body is trying to put you to sleep at 8 in the evening and wake you at 3 in the morning. That is a 7-hour sleep window, and it may be enough sleep for your shifted clock. The problem is that you fight the 8 o'clock drowsiness. Social life, television, family, habit, everything says it is too early to sleep. You stay up until 10 or 11. But the clock does not adjust to your social schedule. It fires the wake signal at 3 regardless, because the clock runs on light and biology, not on your preferences. You lost 2 to 3 hours from the front of your sleep window by staying up late, but the alarm still goes off on the original schedule. The 3 a.m. waking is not a malfunction. It is your shifted clock doing exactly what it was programmed to do, ending the sleep window on time, even though you entered it late. There is a term for this: social jet lag. The gap between your biological clock time and your social clock time creates the same physiological mismatch as flying across 2 or 3 time zones. Your body is in one time zone, your social life is in another, and every night you experience the equivalent of jet lag without ever leaving your house. The drowsiness you fight at 8 p.m. is your body's genuine sleep onset signal. The waking at 3 a.m. is your body's genuine wake signal. The problem is not the signals. The problem is that you have been overriding one without being able to override the other. If you have noticed that you feel drowsy earlier in the evening than you used to, that 9 o'clock feels like midnight used to feel, that staying up for the late news requires effort, that it never required at 40, that your eyelids grow heavy during a film you are genuinely enjoying, that is the phase advance. Your clock shifted. Your social schedule did not. The gap between the two is where the 3 a.m. problem begins. There is a compounding factor that makes this worse for anyone over 65. The shifted clock means your body wants to sleep earlier, but the reduced melatonin means it cannot hold sleep as deeply or as long even when you comply with the earlier schedule. You are caught between two problems: a clock that fires the wake signal too early, and a chemical supply that cannot maintain the sleep signal through the full night. Even if you went to bed at 8, which social life rarely permits, the reduced melatonin might still fail to hold you past 3 or 4. The clock shifted the window. The melatonin shrank it. Now the problem deepens, because the sleep you are in at 3 a.m. is not the same sleep you were in at midnight. Sleep is not one state. It cycles through stages roughly every 90 minutes. Light sleep, deeper sleep, then REM. The stage that matters most for feeling rested is slow wave sleep, stage N3, the deepest phase, where brain waves drop to large, slow delta oscillations at half a hertz to 4 hertz. During slow wave sleep, the glymphatic system activates. Cerebrospinal fluid flushes through brain tissue along channels that open when neurons shrink slightly during deep sleep, clearing metabolic waste including adenosine, the molecule that builds sleep pressure during the day, and amyloid beta proteins, the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. Growth hormone pulses during N3. Tissue repair peaks. Memory consolidation occurs. The hippocampus replays the day's experiences and transfers them to long-term cortical storage. This is the sleep that makes you feel like you actually slept. At age 25, roughly 20% of the night is spent in slow-wave sleep. By 65, that drops to 10 to 15%. By 75, some people get almost none. Bryce Mander at the University of California, Berkeley, has documented this decline in detail. The slow-wave generating circuits in the medial prefrontal cortex deteriorate with age, producing weaker and less frequent delta oscillations. The deep sleep itself becomes shallower. The waves are smaller, the duration shorter, the restorative process is less complete. The glymphatic implications are significant and personal. If deep sleep is the period when the brain clears amyloid beta, the protein that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease, then reduced deep sleep means reduced clearance. Mander's research showed a direct correlation. Older adults with less slow-wave sleep had higher amyloid beta accumulation, and higher amyloid beta accumulation further disrupted slow-wave sleep. The relationship is bidirectional and self-reinforcing. Less deep sleep leads to more amyloid, which leads to less deep sleep, which leads to more amyloid. If you have worried about cognitive decline, about memory becoming less reliable, about the word that sits on the tip of the tongue longer than it used to, about the sharpness that seems to have dulled, protecting slow-wave sleep is not peripheral to that concern. It is central. The brain's waste clearance system runs during the sleep stage that is shrinking fastest. Every intervention that increases deep sleep duration is also an intervention that supports the brain's ability to clear the proteins associated with neurodegeneration. If you have noticed that you never feel fully rested no matter how many hours you spend in bed, that 8 hours produces the recovery that 6 hours used to produce, that you wake in the morning with the sense that something was missing from the night, The missing component may be slow-wave sleep. The hours were there. The depth was not. Slow-wave sleep that remains concentrates in the first half of the night, the first 2 to 3 sleep cycles. By 2 or 3 in the morning, most of the deep sleep budget has been spent. What remains for the second half of the night is lighter stage 1 and stage 2 sleep, interspersed with REM. Light sleep has a dramatically lower arousal threshold. Stimuli that would not have registered during slow-wave sleep. A slight temperature change in the room, a bathroom urge from a bladder that fills faster with age, a noise from outside, even the natural shift in body position, can push you above the waking threshold in light sleep. You're waking at 3 a.m., partly because the sleep you are in at 3 a.m. is physiologically different from the sleep you are in at midnight. The fortress walls got thinner as the night progressed. By 3 o'clock, you are sleeping behind a screen door instead of a vault, and anything that deep sleep would have absorbed without your ever knowing can now push you above the waking threshold. Perhaps you have wondered why you could sleep through thunderstorms at 30 and now wake at the sound of a refrigerator cycling on. The physics is not about the noise, it is about the stage of sleep you are in when the noise arrives. At midnight, during slow-wave sleep, your arousal threshold is high. The brain is running delta waves that suppress responsiveness to external stimuli. At 3 a.m., in stage 1 or stage 2, the threshold has dropped to a fraction of its midnight level. The same sound that the sleeping brain would have filtered at midnight wakes you at 3 because the brain is no longer running the program that filters it. A third signal arrives on its own schedule, and it is chemical. Your body runs a cortisol rhythm called the cortisol awakening response. In the final hours of sleep, the adrenal glands begin increasing cortisol output, preparing the body for waking, mobilizing glucose into the bloodstream, priming the immune system for the day's pathogens, raising blood pressure and heart rate toward daytime operating levels. In a young adult, this cortisol rise begins around 4 to 5 in the morning and peaks roughly 30 to 45 minutes after waking. With age, the rise begins earlier, 2 to 3 a.m. in many older adults, because the same circadian phase advance that shifted the sleep-wake window also shifted the cortisol curve. Every rhythm the suprachiasmatic nucleus controls moves in the same direction. Cortisol alone does not wake you. But combined with already light sleep and a shifted circadian clock, the cortisol rise adds a third signal, pushing you toward wakefulness at precisely the hour when the other 2 systems have already weakened your defenses. 3 systems converging on the same window, the clock says wake up, the sleep stage says the walls are thin, and the cortisol says the body is preparing for morning. All 3 signals arrive at 3 a.m. Not by coincidence, but because all 3 are governed by the same shifted circadian master clock. If you have noticed that the waking comes at almost exactly the same time every night, not randomly scattered across the early morning hours, but clustered within the same 30-minute window, that precision is the signature of a circadian-driven event, not random arousal. And cortisol is antagonistic to melatonin. The 2 hormones suppress each other. Cortisol inhibits melatonin production, and melatonin suppresses cortisol. In a young person with high melatonin and correctly timed cortisol, the 2 hormones hand off smoothly. Melatonin dominates the night, cortisol rises toward morning. The transition is seamless. In an aging body with depleted melatonin and early arriving cortisol, the handoff happens too soon. When cortisol starts rising at 2 or 3 a.m. and melatonin is already low, the biochemical conditions for staying asleep collapse. The melatonin that should be holding you under is insufficient. The cortisol that should not be arriving for another 2 hours is already here. 2 hormones that are supposed to hand off like relay runners, one finishing as the other begins, instead colliding in the same hour because both shifted on the same aging clock, and the balance tips toward waking. What you experience, lying in the dark, mind active, unable to return to sleep despite exhaustion, is cortisol-driven prefrontal activation occurring in a brain that no longer has enough melatonin to counteract it. You are chemically awake. The feeling that you should be able to sleep but cannot is the gap between what your expectations say. It is 3 a.m., you should be asleep, and what your chemistry is doing, which is preparing for a day that your shifted clock thinks is about to begin. Here is why the waking at 3 a.m. feels so different from waking at 7, and why the thoughts that arrive are the worst thoughts you have. When you wake at 6 or 7 in the morning, cortisol is high, light enters your eyes, and your prefrontal cortex comes online in its task-oriented mode. You think about what to do, what to eat, where to go. Executive function engages. The thinking is directed, practical, forward-looking. Problems that exist at 7 a.m. feel like problems to be solved. Manageable, bounded, addressable. When you wake at 3 a.m. in the dark with no task to perform and no light to signal daytime, a different network activates. The default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing system, fires in the absence of external input and directed task. This is the rumination network. It runs replays of conversations you had years ago. It generates worry scenarios about events that may never happen. It revisits regrets from decades past with a vividness that feels more real than memory should. It rehearses confrontations that will never take place. It asks questions that have no answers at any hour, let alone at 3 in the morning. At 3 a.m., the default mode network has nothing competing with it. No light, no task, no external stimulation, no social interaction. And, critically, the executive prefrontal cortex that would normally evaluate, contextualize, and override the rumination is still partially offline. The prefrontal cortex is the last brain region to fully activate upon waking. It requires light exposure and time to reach its full operating capacity. This is the region that says this thought is not an emergency. This worry is not proportionate to reality. This problem can wait until morning and will look different then. At 3 a.m., that region is sleeping while the default mode network is running at full power. You are awake enough to think, but the thinking is the uncontrolled, self-referential, catastrophizing kind, because the system that controls and contextualizes thought has not caught up with the system that generates it. The worry loop feels more intense at 3 a.m. than the same thoughts would feel at 3 p.m. because the brain regions that regulate emotional response and assign proportionality are not yet operational. You are running the worry software without the control software. The thoughts feel urgent and catastrophic because the part of your brain that would tell you they are neither is still asleep. I find this the most useful thing anyone over 65 can know about 3 a.m. The thoughts are not true in the way they feel true. They are running on hardware that cannot evaluate them yet. The 3 a.m. thoughts have a specific quality that daytime worry does not. A sense of certainty, of inevitability, of problems being larger, and solutions being fewer than they actually are. The distortion is not emotional. It is architectural. The brain regions that generate worry are online. The brain regions that evaluate worry are not. By 7 in the morning, when the prefrontal cortex has fully activated and light has entered the eyes and cortisol has reached its appropriate peak, the same problems that felt catastrophic at 3 a.m. feel manageable. Nothing changed about the problems. Everything changed about which brain regions are processing them. If you've lain in the dark at 3 a.m. and felt that your problems were larger, your regrets sharper, your fears more certain than they would be by breakfast, that was not weakness, and it was not anxiety disorder. It was the default mode network running without prefrontal supervision, amplified by cortisol that arrived early, in a brain that had already run through its deep sleep budget and could not pull you back under. 4 systems, all doing what the physics of aging programmed them to do, all converging on the same hour. Here is what the physics says you can do, and every intervention targets a specific system. Circadian phase advance, the root cause, responds to light. Evening light exposure between 7 and 9 p.m. delays the circadian clock, pushing the sleep onset window later and the wake signal later with it. This is the reverse of morning light. Morning light advances the clock, making you sleep and wake earlier. Evening light delays it. If you are falling asleep at 8 p.m. and waking at 3 a.m., your clock needs to be pushed later, and bright light in the evening is the specific input that shifts it, not a phone screen. Phone screens are too dim to shift the clock, and the blue spectrum light suppresses melatonin at the worst possible time. A bright room with the overhead lights on, or a 10,000 lux light therapy lamp positioned at eye level, provides the intensity the suprachiasmatic nucleus needs to register a delay signal. The shift takes days to weeks of consistent evening exposure. You are using light to recalibrate a timer. The same physics that synchronizes the clock to the sun, applied deliberately at a different hour. There is a counterintuitive corollary. If you are waking too early, reduce your morning bright light exposure in the first hour after waking. Morning light advances the clock, makes it earlier. If your clock is already too early, morning light makes the problem worse. Wearing sunglasses for the first hour after waking, or staying in dim indoor light, reduces the advancing signal and allows the evening light to work more effectively in the other direction. Bedroom temperature matters more than most people realize, and the physics is specific. Core body temperature needs to drop by roughly 1 to 1.5 degrees for sleep onset and maintenance. A bedroom temperature of 18 to 19 degrees Celsius, roughly 65 to 67 Fahrenheit, facilitates this drop. A warm bedroom prevents the core temperature decline and makes sleep lighter and more fragmented. If you wake at 3 a.m. and the room is warm, the temperature alone may be pushing you above the arousal threshold that cooler air would have kept you below. Melatonin is supplementable, but the dose matters enormously, and most people get it wrong. The melatonin supplements commonly sold in stores are 5 to 10 milligrams. The amount your pineal gland naturally produces is roughly 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram. Physiological replacement, the dose that mimics what the aging pineal gland no longer provides, is 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram, taken 1 to 2 hours before the desired sleep time. Higher doses can cause morning grogginess, paradoxical wakefulness in the middle of the night, and disruption of the very circadian rhythm you are trying to support. More is not better. The physics is pharmacokinetic. You are replacing a signal at the concentration the body expects, not flooding the receptors with 10 times the normal input. Deep sleep decline responds to physical activity during the day. Walking, sustained moderate movement for 40 minutes, 3 times per week, increases slow-wave sleep duration in older adults, particularly when the walking occurs in the morning or early afternoon rather than evening. The mechanism runs through adenosine and core temperature. Physical activity builds sleep pressure by increasing adenosine accumulation during the day, and it raises core body temperature, which then drops in the evening. The evening temperature drop is one of the signals the body uses to initiate deep sleep. Falling core temperature tells the suprachiasmatic nucleus that the body is transitioning from day to night. More physical activity means more adenosine, a larger temperature drop, and a deeper first sleep cycle. More time in restorative N3 before the second half of the night arrives and the walls thin. A warm bath or shower 90 minutes before bed works through the same temperature physics. The warm water raises skin temperature, triggering vasodilation. Blood vessels near the skin surface open, releasing core body heat rapidly. The result is an accelerated core temperature drop that the brain reads as a sleep onset signal. The warm bath does not warm you towards sleep. It cools you by triggering the heat release that drops core temperature faster than it would drop on its own. At 3 a.m., the default mode network problem responds to a specific countermeasure. If you wake and cannot return to sleep within 15 to 20 minutes, give your prefrontal cortex a low stimulation directed task. Listen to a spoken word recording, an audiobook, a podcast, a radio program, at low volume, in the dark. The content does not need to be interesting. It needs to be directed, sequential, narrative, requiring your attention to follow, so that the prefrontal cortex engages and suppresses the default mode network's monopoly on your awareness. The rumination loop breaks when the executive system has something else to track. This is not about boring yourself to sleep. It is about giving the prefrontal cortex a task that is demanding enough to displace the default mode network, but not stimulating enough to increase arousal. The narrow band between those two thresholds is where spoken word audio operates. Just enough cognitive demand to break the loop, not enough to sustain full wakefulness. Do not turn on a bright light. The light will advance the clock further and suppress whatever melatonin remains. Do not check your phone. The screen light and the content both increase cortisol and arousal, And the social media algorithms are specifically designed to capture attention, which is the opposite of what you need at 3 a.m. A voice in the dark, at low volume, giving the executive brain something to follow, is the intervention that matches the mechanism. Many people find they fall back asleep within 10 to 20 minutes, not because the audiobook is boring, but because engaging the prefrontal cortex broke the default mode loop and allowed the residual sleep drive to pull them back under. 4 systems: a clock that advanced, addressable with evening light; a deep sleep phase that shrank, addressable with daytime walking and evening temperature management; a cortisol curve that moved earlier, addressable with circadian recalibration; a melatonin supply that diminished, addressable with low-dose physiological replacement. None of them are malfunctions. All of them are the physics of an aging body doing what the physics predicts, running rhythms that were set for a younger system and never received the update that the body changed. Every one of them has a specific, targeted intervention that works with the biology rather than against it. The ceiling at 3 a.m. is not your enemy. It is a signal, 4 signals arriving together, each one readable, each one addressable. The body was never broken, the clock moved, and the physics can move it back.